In the southern countryside of Germany, nestled between fog-kissed hills and quiet streets, there existed a town called Wellstein. From the outside, it looked like something straight off a postcard: tidy walkways, perfectly trimmed hedges, polite traffic, and playgrounds filled with cheerful children. Everything about it radiated order, calm, and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, but arranged, like part of a plan. But below the surface of this picturesque town, something had been forgotten. Something sacred. Something that once echoed with voices in prayer and footsteps of those seeking peace. 10 years ago, on the edge of Wellstein, there had been a modest refugee center. It wasn't grand, just a few simple buildings, home to dozens of families fleeing violence and war. Among these was a small white prayer hall with a green dome and a single tower. It wasn't large, and certainly not famous, but for those who gathered inside, it had been everything, a spiritual anchor in a foreign land. Then came a change in government policy. The refugee center was shut down. The land was sold to private developers. The prayer hall was demolished quietly, without any formal announcement. No memorial plaque. No photographs. Just rubble cleared away and replaced with an urban park, complete with a fountain, a cycling path, and benches. Now, people walk dogs over the very spot where once, families had bowed in devotion. Children kicked soccer balls across soil that had once felt the weight of reverence. Most forgot. But not everyone. Lena was only 9 years old, a girl with golden hair and wide, curious eyes. She lived just 2 blocks from the park with her mother. Her memories of her grandfather, Mustafa, were faint. He had passed away before she could speak full sentences. She barely remembered his face, maybe a beard, a calming scent of oil, and a soft hum that came from deep in his chest when he thought no one was listening. But lately, Lena had been dreaming. It started on a stormy Tuesday night. Rain lashed against her window as she jolted awake, not from fear, but from something she didn't understand. In the dream, she had been standing in the park, alone. There were no children, no cyclists, no sound. Just silence. A kind of silence that made her feel both safe and unsettled. Then she heard it, a sound, faint and distant, like someone calling out softly from beneath the ground. It wasn't music. It wasn't a voice she knew. It was more like the earth itself was whispering. The next night, it happened again. And again after that. Always the same, the park, the silence, and a strange call rising gently through the soil. She didn't understand the words, but something in her heart responded to them, like remembering a song you've never learned but somehow already know. That Friday, she asked her mother a question that made her pause mid-breakfast. "Did Grandpa ever sing from underground?" Her mother looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I think I hear him." "From the ground." Her mother gave a gentle smile and brushed Lena's hair from her face. "You've got his soul, sweetheart. That's all." But Lena wasn't satisfied. That afternoon, as sunlight painted golden lines across the park grass, she went there alone. The park was buzzing with life, kids laughing near the fountain, cyclists weaving through the trees, an old man selling pretzels under a red umbrella. Everything felt normal. But not to her. She walked across the lawn and stopped at a spot near the fountain's curve, exactly where her dreams always took her. Her heart beat faster. She knelt down, touched the grass, and closed her eyes. She whispered the only phrase she remembered from her dreams, softly, clumsily. And in that moment, everything around her seemed to shift. The wind paused. A bird froze in the air. The air grew heavier. Then, beneath her palms, she felt something, a slight vibration. The earth itself trembled, gently, like something alive had stirred. She gasped and pulled back. One of the park workers noticed her and called out, "Everything okay?" She nodded quickly and ran home, heart racing, unsure whether she was afraid or amazed. That night, her dream changed. This time, she didn't just hear the sound, she saw something. A dome. Old, cracked, and covered in soil, but glowing faintly. She reached out to touch it in her dream, and as her fingers made contact, the ground peeled back like paint, revealing a long-lost painting. She woke with tears in her eyes and a strange warmth in her chest. 2 days later, something unusual happened in the park. Near the western corner, not far from the fountain, a strange dip formed in the soil, a small sink, just a few feet wide. The city's maintenance team chalked it up to soil compression and fenced off the area with caution tape. But it wasn't just a dip. It was the beginning. The following day, a gardener attempting to plant flowers in the same area struck something solid with his spade. He expected a pipe or rock. But what he hit felt different, smooth, structured. Like brick, but older. Intrigued, the city called in an archaeological team for assessment. By the next morning, word had begun to spread. Local news crews arrived. Curious residents gathered. Police set up temporary barriers. And as the soil was carefully removed inch by inch, something emerged, the very tip of a green dome, kissed with age and dirt. And from within the hollow of the earth, even though no one could explain how, a strange sensation radiated outward. Not sound. Not wind. Something felt. Something remembered. Across town, in a cramped apartment in Berlin, a young man named Matthias Adler watched the unfolding news coverage on his laptop. A headline read, "Mysterious ancient structure found beneath German park." He leaned forward. His hand trembled as he adjusted the volume. The drone footage zoomed in on the partially exposed dome. And suddenly, Matthias felt something crack in his chest. He had been having dreams too. For weeks. Dreams of a woman in a scarf, standing in a sunlit courtyard, whispering something he couldn't understand. Always with the same building behind her, a white structure with a green dome. He had never told anyone. He didn't even believe in dreams. But the moment he saw the image of the Wellstein dome, he knew. He packed a bag. Back in Wellstein, Lena returned to the fence each day. Her mother stood beside her, unsure whether to be worried or proud. "You sure you're okay, sweetheart?" she asked. Lena didn't answer. She just stared at the growing shape beneath the soil, and whispered to herself, as if speaking to something that could hear her. "Please come back." That night, while the park slept under floodlights and camera drones, the dome continued to rise. And so did the questions. Not just about what had been found, but why it had returned. And why now? Because some buildings fall apart and vanish forever. But others wait. Wait for hearts that forgot how to listen. By the next sunrise, Wellstein was no longer just a quiet town tucked into Germany's southern countryside. It was a name flashing across headlines, a trending tag, a viral sensation. Footage of the uncovered dome, barely peeking from the soil, was played repeatedly on morning news shows and social media platforms. People debated whether it was a religious relic, an architectural miracle, or simply a well-preserved remnant from forgotten history. But behind every theory, one truth lingered: no one had expected this. The site was quickly taken over by government-supervised archaeologists. Metal fencing replaced the plastic caution tape. Uniformed officers guarded the perimeter. And beyond the barriers, an ever-growing crowd of journalists, scholars, and spiritual seekers began to gather. The team's lead archaeologist, Dr. Martin Fuchs, stood near the excavation's edge, his boots covered in clay and his heart pounding with anticipation. He had led digs in Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, but never in a sleepy European town like this. He adjusted his glasses and studied the unearthed structure with a strange sense of reverence. Something about the dome was different. It wasn't just its size, which turned out to be much larger than any refugee prayer room should have been. Nor was it just the shimmering green tile work that, even under layers of soil, still caught the light like gemstones. No, it was the silence around it. Not a dead silence, but a living one. as if the earth itself had paused to listen. On the third day of excavation, more of the structure became visible, intricate tile patterns, finely carved stone blocks, and along the dome's edge, a line of engraved text. Not in Latin or Germanic script, but something older. A classical script, perfectly preserved, wrapping around the dome like a crown. Dr. Fuchs crouched beside the inscription and ran his gloved fingers along the letters. He couldn't read them, not yet. But they moved him. Deeply. Like poetry he had never heard, yet somehow remembered. By midday, the mayor of Wellstein, Heinrich Kraus, arrived at the site wearing a sharp gray suit and a cautious expression. Flanked by aides and security, he stepped up to the excavation zone. "What are we dealing with here?" he asked flatly. Dr. Fuchs didn't look up. His voice was quiet. "Something remarkable." "Historical?" "Yes." "Religious?" Dr. Fuchs finally stood, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yes. And no. It's older than the records we have for any modern place of worship in this area. It doesn't fit anything we know." Kraus frowned. "This is German soil. We'll handle it responsibly. Respectfully. But we can't afford sensationalism." Dr. Fuchs nodded, but said nothing. That evening, 3 diggers working near the western wall of the dome struck something beneath the ground. It wasn't metal or rock, it was too smooth, too precise. They cleared away more earth and discovered a curved stone stairway, descending into darkness. The team stopped work immediately. They hadn't been prepared for a subterranean structure. The city council was called in. Safety concerns were raised. The decision was made to seal off the tunnel until it could be thoroughly inspected. But that night, while the floodlights lit the half-dug earth and the town below fell asleep, something peculiar occurred. At precisely 3:17 a.m., all 5 surveillance cameras placed around the site glitched simultaneously. Not offline, just blank. For exactly 60 seconds. And in those 60 seconds, the guards on duty reported seeing something they couldn't explain. A mist rose from the edges of the dome, faint, silvery, and glowing. It didn't swirl like smoke or drift like fog. It moved with purpose, forming a ring around the exposed structure before vanishing silently. When footage was recovered, the minute of blackout remained. Technicians found no errors. No interference. No explanation. Back in her home, Lena lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't dreamt that night. Because she hadn't needed to. Something in her was awake. That same morning, over 500 miles away, Matthias Adler boarded a train from Berlin to Wellstein. His bag was light. Only a notebook, a sweater, and a stack of religious texts he had been studying privately. Matthias wasn't a religious man. At least, not until now. The grandson of a Nazi officer, he had grown up with pride, guilt, and confusion braided tightly together. He had spent years pushing away faith, seeking truth in books and silence. But recently, he hadn't been able to escape the dreams. In each one, a woman stood in a dusty courtyard, not in Germany, but somewhere older, drier, sacred. She didn't speak, but her lips moved. Behind her, a dome. The same dome from the excavation site. And every time he woke, one word echoed in his mind, not in a language he knew, but one he had come to feel rather than understand. He didn't tell anyone about the dreams. But now, he was on his way to the place that haunted them. By the 5th day of excavation, the structure was no longer just a curiosity. It was a spectacle. Visitors lined the fence to catch glimpses. People prayed near the gate, cried, whispered stories of their own visions and dreams. Drones flew overhead. News vans created a media village near the park. It wasn't just a dig site anymore. It was becoming something else. On that day, another strange event occurred. One of the excavators, a large yellow machine that had worked flawlessly, abruptly stopped functioning. No fuel issues. No mechanical failure. It just stopped. 10 minutes later, a second machine malfunctioned. Then a third. Technicians searched for problems. They found none. Some said it was electrical interference. Others suspected sabotage. But Dr. Fuchs began to wonder if the issue wasn't technical at all. In his notebook that night he wrote, "There's something here that doesn't want force. Or maybe something that wants us to remember how to be gentle." That same evening, Matthias arrived in Wellstein. He didn't head to a hotel. He walked straight to the park. When he reached the perimeter of the site, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fence. The dome shimmered in twilight, half revealed, half buried, like a memory surfacing slowly from sleep. He approached the gate where 2 guards stood. "I don't want to go in," he said quietly. "I just want to stand near it." They looked at him warily. "I'm not dangerous," he added. "I just want to pray." That word, pray, carried weight. One of the guards hesitated, then opened the gate slightly. 5 minutes, he said. "You weren't here." Matthias nodded, stepped through, and walked slowly to the dome's edge. He removed his shoes, stood barefoot on the cold grass, and whispered not to the sky, but to the earth. "If there is something real in this place, I'm ready to feel it." A breeze brushed his cheek. A warmth rose from the soil. And without thinking, Matthias knelt. Not as a ritual. Not as a follower. But as someone surrendering the weight of questions he had carried too long. His forehead touched the ground. And the world, for a moment, held its breath. Morning arrived in Wellstein, but the town no longer woke with the same rhythms. Once filled with the chatter of commuters and the quiet movement of orderly lives, the streets now echoed with new voices. Pilgrims, reporters, scholars, and skeptics lined up near the excavation site. Some came with cameras, others with open hands. They didn't all know why they had come, but they had felt something pull them here. At the center of it all, the ancient dome continued to rise, slowly being uncovered like a fossil beneath time. But on this particular morning, it wasn't just another layer of stone that was discovered. It was something else. Something hidden with intention. Dr. Fuchs stood beside the growing team of archaeologists and assistants. Dust clung to his skin like a second layer, and exhaustion had set into his bones. But when the lead technician shouted that they had found a sealed marble plate beneath the dome's base, his fatigue vanished. The workers cleared the area cautiously. Beneath the dome, embedded deep in the soil, was a rectangular stone slab, sealed with rusted iron and carved with strange, elegant patterns. The team gathered around in silent awe. It didn't look like a foundation stone. It looked like a door. Dr. Fuchs crouched beside it, brushing away the remaining dirt. After hours of careful chiseling and brushing, the slab was finally lifted. Underneath, wrapped in a thick velvet cloth threaded with gold, was a scroll. It looked impossibly intact. No water damage, no insect holes, no signs of age beyond the deep, sacred stillness it seemed to carry. Fuchs didn't touch it at first. He simply stared. He felt as though the air had thickened around it, as though the object was not merely historical but alive. When he finally reached out, he did so with reverence, not curiosity. As he lifted the scroll, a gust of wind blew through the excavation pit, odd since they were well below ground level. The crowd above felt it too. Some said it smelled faintly sweet, like old forests. Others said it smelled like prayer. The scroll was immediately taken to a secure research tent and placed under soft light for examination. Historians from Berlin were called. A classical language expert from Istanbul was flown in. Armed guards were posted around the clock. And though the artifact had not yet been opened, people could feel that its contents would change something. Outside the tent, Lena waited. She stood silently near the fence, still holding the photo of her grandfather. Her mother had tried to convince her to stay home, to rest, to be a child. But Lena had changed. She was no longer distracted by toys or games. Her drawings had shifted from fairy tale castles to towers and domes she had never physically seen. Her voice had quieted. Her presence had deepened. Her mother watched from a distance, half afraid, half awestruck. Inside the tent, the language expert stared at the unopened scroll. "This is an Ottoman," he murmured. "It's older." "How much older?" asked Dr. Fuchs, standing nearby. The expert took a long breath. "At least from the 7th century. Possibly even earlier." Fuchs froze. "That would place it within a generation of ancient prophets." The scholar nodded. "Yes. And judging by the script, it wasn't written for kings or rulers." He leaned in, brushing his fingers lightly over the first exposed lines. "It was written for the forgotten." That evening, the scroll was gently unrolled under low light. No one expected what came next. The text wasn't theological in the traditional sense. It wasn't a list of rules or instructions. It read like a personal account, a journey of a man who had traveled from a land of war to the far north, carrying with him only faith, a memory of a sacred text, and the hope that even in a land that did not recognize the divine, the earth itself still remembered. Dr. Fuchs read the first few lines aloud, voice unsteady. "I came to the land of the north, carrying the name of the One. They had buried the call. But the soil knew. And it rose again." No one in the tent spoke. Matthias, who had been allowed into the reading due to his unusual connection to the dome, felt something shift in his chest. He placed his hand over his heart and closed his eyes. Outside, Lena stood at the edge of the fence, completely still. Then, without warning, she began to speak. Her mother turned, shocked. Lena's voice rose slowly, and as she did, she began to recite, word for word, the same lines from the scroll being read inside the tent. Lines she had never seen. Phrases in a script she had never learned. A nearby guard heard her and radioed the tent in confusion. "There's a little girl out here. She's reciting the same thing you're reading inside." Dr. Fuchs rushed outside. When he saw Lena standing there, eyes closed, words flowing from her lips as if carried by wind, he didn't question it. He only listened. When she finished, she opened her eyes and looked at him. "He told me it's my turn now," she said softly. "Who did?" he asked. "My grandfather." A hush fell over the growing crowd. By the next morning, news of the scroll had gone global. Footage of Lena reciting ancient text went viral. Reporters debated the authenticity. Scholars argued timelines. But millions, across continents and languages, didn't care about analysis. They cared about what they felt. Something was stirring. In Brazil, a surgeon paused mid-operation after a patient whispered a phrase from the scroll in her sleep. In South Africa, a schoolteacher dreamt of a dome surrounded by mist and woke weeping. In Japan, a monk who had never left his temple requested that the dome's image be projected onto his wall. "It reminds me," he said, "of a silence I forgot." Back in Wellstein, a deeper section of the mosque had been uncovered, a stairway leading downward. Authorities insisted it remain sealed for safety. But on the third night, 3 workers stationed near the tunnel reported something they couldn't forget. They had heard it. Not music. Not static. A whisper. A rhythm. A melody that wasn't a song, but something older. One worker, a Polish man named Tomasz, burst into tears. "I don't speak the language," he cried, "but I knew it was a prayer." At first, security dismissed it as imagination. Until the next night, when one of the guards said the same thing. "It didn't come from the radio," he said. "It came from the stones." The dome wasn't just a discovery now. It was a conversation. Between the past and the present. Between belief and memory. Between those who thought they had buried something. And those realizing it was only waiting. The 6th day brought with it more than just visitors. It brought questions. Not the kind that historians ask over tea, but the kind that shift tectonic plates in hearts. By now, the stairway beneath the dome had been fully revealed. Covered in moss and wrapped in mystery, it led into darkness, not just physical, but historical. The city council had ordered it closed off. Signs reading, "Unstable structure, do not enter," were hung on yellow tape. Still, that didn't stop the speculation. Journalists zoomed in with long lenses. Spiritual seekers sat cross-legged at the perimeter, whispering to themselves. Locals brought candles, some placing them along the fence without saying a word. Dr. Fuchs couldn't stop thinking about it. He had seen many underground chambers in his lifetime. Roman crypts, medieval tunnels, forgotten cisterns. But none had felt like this. It wasn't just the architecture. It was the atmosphere, like time had folded in on itself. Like the tunnel was not merely a passage downward, but inward. That night, after hours, 3 figures stood at the edge of the stairwell. Dr. Fuchs, Tomasz the Polish worker who'd heard the whispers, and Matthias Adler, the man whose life had turned on the very ground beneath them. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Each was there for different reasons, but they all felt the same pull. It was 12:17 a.m. when they began the descent. Their flashlights illuminated the old stone steps, worn from centuries of forgotten footsteps. The air grew colder with every meter thicker, like they were sinking into something buried not just by earth, but by choice. The walls of the tunnel weren't plain. As they went deeper, inscriptions emerged. Not written in modern script, but a flowing, intricate pattern of symbols and phrases carved directly into the stone. Strangely, the carvings shimmered faintly, as if responding to their presence. Matthias paused, brushing his hand against one of the lines. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. "This isn't just a tunnel," he whispered. "It's a message." They reached the bottom. There, beneath the dome, was a circular chamber. The air was still. Sacred. In the center stood a pedestal, carved from white stone, unblemished by time. And atop it, exactly as Lena had described in her dream, lay a scroll wrapped in green velvet, sealed with gold thread. No one moved at first. Even breathing felt intrusive. Dr. Fuchs stepped forward slowly. He examined the pedestal's base. More inscriptions, but these in a language Matthias was now slowly learning through his studies of ancient texts. He leaned closer and began to read aloud. "This record is not for scholars, nor kings, but for hearts that once turned away, and now tremble." The chamber fell into silence. Tomasz knelt without being asked. Matthias removed his shoes. Dr. Fuchs, for the first time in his academic life, reached out not as a researcher, but as a human being. He lifted the scroll. It didn't crumble. It didn't resist. It felt ready. They carried it back up the stairs, one careful step at a time. When they reached the surface, the wind stirred again. A soft breeze. A welcome. The scroll was taken into the secured tent for inspection. Word spread quickly, not because anyone had leaked it, but because some things can't be hidden. Lena stood at the fence as the scroll passed. She didn't say a word. She only smiled, as if seeing an old friend returned. The next morning, the scholar from Istanbul who had been studying the first scroll was called back urgently. He arrived, weary but focused. When he opened the new scroll, his eyes widened. "It's the same hand," he said. "Same author. Same ink. Same thread." Dr. Fuchs leaned in. "So it's part of the first scroll?" "No," the scholar said. "It's the continuation." Hours passed in near silence as the team translated and documented. The words were poetic, but not abstract. They told a story, not of conquest, but of planting. Of a man who had come from distant lands, fleeing war and carrying only faith. He had settled in a place where no one believed, but the ground had been soft. Not the physical soil, but the spiritual. He had prayed. He had whispered. He had remembered. And somehow, the earth had listened. The final line of the scroll read, "If they silence the voice, the soil will remember the echo." That evening, another crowd gathered at the fence, not to witness a spectacle, but to be near what they couldn't explain. Among them was a woman in her 60s, a former opera singer from Vienna. She had never been religious. But in recent days she said she'd started humming melodies in her sleep. Melodies she hadn't composed. Melodies that matched the rhythm of the words being read aloud from the scroll. "I don't know what this is," she said softly to a reporter. "But it feels like a calling back." Meanwhile, Lena had stopped speaking altogether, not out of fear, but out of depth. Her mother, worried, took her to a doctor. But all tests came back normal. "She's not mute," the doctor said. "She's just still." At home, Lena spent her days drawing images of the dome, the tunnel, and the scrolls. But also, new things. Things no one had seen yet. A wooden archway. A sealed door. A room with a single beam of light. When Dr. Fuchs was shown the drawings, he turned pale. "We haven't uncovered that yet," he said. "But we're digging in that direction." Another day passed. Then another. On the 10th day since the first discovery, something extraordinary happened. All surveillance cameras near the tunnel entrance went offline, not from power failure, but from something untraceable. At that exact moment, multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing a soft amber light glowing at the bottom of the stairs. No one had entered. But the scroll, the one just brought up, was glowing faintly under infrared, as if responding to the light below. That same night, far across the city, an elderly man woke from a vivid dream. A Holocaust survivor, he had long kept his trauma locked away. But now, he called for his daughter with tears in his eyes. "I saw a boy," he said. "A young man crying." "Who?" she asked. "The German boy. He was kneeling, in front of a book." "A religious text?" "No," he said. "Something older. Something that didn't belong to one people." Then he closed his eyes and whispered. "It belonged to everyone." By the next morning, the scroll had been partially translated and made public. News stations across Europe covered it. In places where faith had long been pushed into shadows, the words were finding new life. People weren't arguing about doctrine anymore. They were weeping. Not because they were told to, but because something inside them, something old and good, was waking up. Within days of the second scroll's discovery, the story had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a local headline. No longer just a historical anomaly. It had become something much larger, a mirror held up to the world. News anchors struggled to describe it without sounding breathless. Spiritual awakening, some called it. Psychological contagion, others claimed. But none could deny that something real was unfolding, and it was spreading faster than logic could contain. In a small school in Jakarta, morning lessons paused as teachers gathered children to read aloud translative lines from the scroll. In a street corner of Nairobi, an imam broke down mid-sermon, overcome by the words he had only read once. In Toronto, a Catholic woman dreamed of the underground dome before she even saw an image of it. She wept when she found out it existed. But nowhere was the tension felt more than in Berlin. Germany's Chancellor, Elise Reinhardt, called an emergency cabinet meeting. "This is not just a discovery," she said, pacing before her ministers. "It is a symbol, and symbols spread." She wasn't worried about faith. She was worried about order. Germany was entering an election year. Social stability was fragile. The rise of global spirituality, driven by what many were calling the Scroll of Mercy, had sparked debates in political halls and youth forums alike. "People are gathering in parks to pray," her chief of staff said. "Teenagers are quoting scroll verses on live streams. Old churches are reporting unexplainable crowds." The Minister of Defense leaned forward. We should monitor gatherings. This could spiral into something uncontrollable. Shall we classify it? Asked another. Classify a scroll? Someone scoffed. No, the Chancellor said firmly. But we can restrict activity around it. Limit crowds. Regulate access. Label it disruptive if necessary. Her digital security advisor lifted a tablet. 12 million digital engagements so far. Half from outside Germany. What are they saying? Reinhard asked. He turned the screen. A photo of the dome. Soft golden light on green tile. Below it 5 words. They tried to bury light. Underneath, trending hashtags. Hashtag scroll of mercy. Hashtag the soil remembers. Hashtag return to truth. Back in Wellstein, locals had already started calling the area the Mercy Zone. Posters appeared on lampposts. Teenagers sprayed verses onto old factory walls. Retirees gathered silently at dusk just to sit near the gates. None of it was organized. None of it violent. But it terrified those in power. Meanwhile, inside the excavation site, more of the ancient structure was surfacing. Wooden archways appeared, preserved in impossibly perfect condition. A second dome emerged. And behind it, a locked wooden door, untouched for generations. The scroll scholar who had been overseeing the translation now noticed something curious. Under special lighting, the final page of the second scroll revealed faint ink, invisible under normal light. A new line emerged. He read it aloud. When the hearts cried together, open the room. That morning, Dr. Fuchs called for a town gathering at the community center. He stood before scientists, historians, and a growing sea of ordinary people. It's time, he said. 2 structural engineers worked through the day to unseal the wooden door. It creaked and groaned as if protesting, but finally it gave way. Beyond it was a narrow passage leading into a chamber the size of a small classroom. The air inside was thick with age, and something else, something fragrant and grounding. On the stone floor lay a simple prayer mat, aged but intact. On the wall opposite, engraved in 2 languages, one ancient, one modern, were the words, "This house belongs to the one who never left." When they read it aloud, several in the room cried. One man fainted. A woman whispered, "This is sacred ground." That same day, news of the chamber hit the internet. Conversions began to be reported in unexpected places. In Brazil, a heart surgeon recited words from the scroll live on television and declared his embrace of a new path. In Sweden, a physicist said the energy readings around the dome didn't align with any known physical laws. In Thailand, a Buddhist monk visited the site, sat for 2 days in silence, then spoke one sentence. It is the same light, only spoken differently. The world listened. But so did those who wished to silence it. A confidential document leaked from a European Commission warned of unregulated spiritual mobilization, potential destabilization of youth identity, emergence of undocumented trans-faith communities. In response, a popular TV host asked live on air, "Are we witnessing a miracle, or the beginning of ideological collapse?" Lena, the little girl who had heard the Earth's whisper before anyone else, had now become a symbol. Scholars came from across Europe to study her dreams, her drawings, her fluency in a language she had never been taught. Some began calling her chosen. Others a prophet. Her mother was quick to stop such claims. "She's not a prophet," she said firmly. "She's a mirror. This isn't about her. It's about what she's showing us." Lena herself rarely spoke now, but when she did, her words carried weight. "It's not about me," she told the reporter quietly. "It's about remembering what we silenced." And Matthias? He had changed too. No longer the silent grandson of a disgraced war general, Matthias now led nightly circles of reflection outside the site. People from all walks of life gathered to read translations of the scroll, to share their dreams, to sit in shared silence. Not as converts. Not as believers in any one tradition. But as people who were listening again. During one session, a young man broke down. He was the grandson of a soldier from the Second World War. "I never believed I deserved peace," he said. "But when I sat near the dome, it felt like the earth forgave me before I forgave myself." He whispered words of commitment that night, not for others, but for himself. And then, the backlash came. A far-right political group in Munich published a document calling the Mosque an ideological Trojan horse. Some claimed it was religious infiltration disguised as mysticism. One night, graffiti appeared on the dome's outer wall. "Dust to dust. No one is coming to save you." But before sunrise, a storm rolled in, heavy, sudden, and completely unforecasted. Rain washed the graffiti away. Some said the air smelled of roses. One passerby took a photo of the dome covered in glistening droplets. The caption he posted went viral. When they defaced it, the sky cried back. By now, the Chancellor could no longer ignore the pressure. She appeared on national television, her voice even and rehearsed. "Germany respects heritage. We also respect logic. While the site in Wellstein remains under scientific review, I urge the public to remain grounded. We must not let emotion override order." But even she wasn't immune. That night, she dreamed she was standing before the dome, barefoot, as water flowed from its base and soaked her feet. In the water floated pages of text she couldn't read. She awoke in sweat, her hands trembling, her palms scented faintly of wood and spice. She did not wear perfume. Back at the site, the scroll's last encrypted phrase was uncovered. "When reason forgets how to feel, remind it, even the stars bow to truth." And so, each day, as machines stayed still and hearts stirred, people came. They brought nothing but memory. They left with something heavier and lighter. The realization that maybe, just maybe, some things buried aren't meant to stay that way. The world kept watching. By the 11th day, Wellstein was no longer just a small German town. It had become a place where something invisible, yet undeniably real, had cracked open the surface of daily life. Some called it an awakening. Others called it a disruption. But whatever it was, it refused to be ignored. Inside the excavation site, engineers continued uncovering new sections of the mosque. Every hour brought something more stunning: engraved marble arches, perfectly preserved wooden beams, geometric patterns that matched no known style. Historians and architects struggled to place it in any single era. It was as though the building existed between centuries, untouched by time yet saturated with it. And then came the next discovery. A third chamber. Behind a narrow passage beneath the main prayer hall, hidden beneath what appeared to be a sealed wall, another space was found. No one expected it. No equipment had detected a hollow area. But one of the guards claimed he heard something while walking by, not sound exactly, but a vibration in the stone. When the wall was removed, what they found wasn't a relic. It was a mirror. Not a decorative one. Not even a reflective surface in the traditional sense. It was embedded into the wall, smooth, dark, glass-like stone, and perfectly preserved. But what it reflected wasn't faces. It reflected memory. People who entered the room described seeing moments from their own lives, moments they had forgotten, repressed, or tried to erase. A woman collapsed sobbing after seeing her father forgive her in a dream she never had. A man who had fought in wars said he saw the face of a child he had harmed, but in the child's eyes was forgiveness. No camera could capture the reflection. Only the soul could. Dr. Fuchs stood before the mirror and saw his mother, long deceased, reading to him in a language he never learned to appreciate. "I ignored her voice," he whispered afterward. "Now I understand why I kept hearing it lately. It was never gone." Word spread fast. Soon, a line formed outside the chamber. Only one person was allowed in at a time. Some stayed a few minutes. Others couldn't bear more than a few seconds. No one left the same. Meanwhile, Lena, the girl who had seen the dome in her dreams, had now become a fixture inside the mosque. No one ordered her to be there. No one escorted her in. She simply walked in each day with her grandfather's scarf and sat cross-legged inside the main prayer hall. She didn't speak. She just sat. And somehow, her presence filled the space with a stillness that couldn't be explained. One journalist tried to interview her. He asked what she felt when she was inside the mosque. She looked at him for a long time and finally whispered, "It's not speaking anymore." "Why not?" he asked. "Because now we are." Matthias had changed, too. The man who had once wandered through philosophy without faith now found himself kneeling daily in silent reflection. He still wore jeans and a plain coat. He didn't preach. But his humility drew others in. One afternoon, a group of elderly Germans approached him after watching him read a verse from the scroll. "We're not religious," one said cautiously. "But this place, it makes us feel something we haven't felt since we were children." "What do you feel?" Matthias asked. "Hope," the woman answered. "Not for answers. Just that we're not alone." He nodded. "That's more than enough." That night, he stood beneath the stars outside the mosque, surrounded by a growing circle of people. "This isn't about converting," he said. "It's about remembering." They sat quietly after that. No chants. No music. Just silence, the kind that listens. Then came a visitor no one expected. A bishop. François Delacroix, one of the Vatican's most respected interfaith figures, arrived without cameras or aides. He wore a simple black coat and walked into the mosque alone. No fanfare. No announcement. He sat in the chamber where the scroll had first been read. He said nothing. After an hour, he emerged, pale and trembling. "I didn't see anything," he told a reporter who caught him at the gate. "But I felt as though I wasn't alone." His visit made headlines. In places of worship across the world, mosques, churches, temples, the story of the Wellstein Mosque was retold with reverence. Not as mythology. Not as doctrine. But as a living reminder that something sacred had risen again from the soil. That same week, people across different continents began reporting the same dream. Thousands of people, who had never met, from all backgrounds and belief systems, described the exact same vision. A field of darkness. A dome rising like the moon. A single tower glowing. And from the structure, a soft, gentle light that flowed upward, not outward, like a prayer ascending. And from the light, a voice. "The world was not dead. You were. Now rise." People woke with tears on their faces. Some ran outside without knowing why. Some fell to their knees beside their beds. Some simply held the faces of their children and wept without words. The phenomenon could not be explained. But it could not be denied. That same day, the United Nations held an emergency session to discuss global religious and spiritual trends. For the first time in modern history, all major representatives voted unanimously on a single issue. The Wellstein Mosque was declared a living heritage site of global spiritual conscience. Not a religious site for one tradition. Not a monument. But a living, breathing space. A place where humanity had remembered what it means to feel. Inside the mosque, the air felt different now. Not heavy, but aware. As if the walls were listening. As if the stones knew they had been forgotten and forgiven. Lena returned to school quietly. She told no one what she had seen in the mirror. But she walked with more confidence now, not proud, but present. And Matthias? He was asked to speak at the World Interfaith Summit in Geneva. He stood before world leaders, spiritual heads, and skeptics alike. He didn't read from notes. He simply said, "They came with machines to unearth a ruin. But what they found wasn't a ruin. It was a mirror. And what it showed us was us. He paused. And the miracle was not that the building survived. The miracle was that we were still able to feel it. He stepped away from the podium in silence. No one clapped. They couldn't. They were crying. In Wellstein, a plaque was quietly placed at the mosque's entrance the next morning. It had no logo. No signature. Just 5 simple words. This house never stopped listening. And as the sun rose again, slowly, gently, through mist and memory, the mosque stood tall. Not as a symbol of conquest, but as a home for returning hearts. It began with a siren. Shrill, sharp, and out of place. Just past midnight, 3 unmarked vans pulled into Wellstein under the cover of fog. Their headlights were off. No license plates. No insignia. The kind of vehicles you only saw in the darkest chapters of history books. Men in plain black uniforms stepped out, moving with precision and silence. No introductions. No warnings. Orders had been issued at the highest levels of government. Secure the site. Remove the scroll. Evacuate all non-official personnel. Reassert control. Dr. Fuchs was woken in his tent and escorted out without time to grab his notes. Matthias was handcuffed and led away from the dome without explanation. Lena and her mother were placed under temporary house arrest. 2 officers were stationed outside their door, watching every movement. "This is a temporary containment measure," said the officer in charge. But the town knew better. It was an attempt to bury the light again. By sunrise, the entire park was sealed off. Tall fences blocked all entry. Drones flew overhead. Snipers were spotted on nearby rooftops. The dome was covered with a large black tarp. The scroll was placed inside a sealed crate and loaded onto a military transport vehicle. Destination unknown. A single archivist was permitted to accompany the crate. The drive began in silence, cutting through fog-shrouded countryside. But halfway to Berlin, something strange happened. The engine died. Not a stall. A full shutdown. Battery, ignition, dashboard, everything went dark. The convoy pulled over. Technicians swarmed the truck. "This vehicle is mechanically perfect," one said. "There's no reason it shouldn't be running." They brought a replacement truck. It failed too. Then something even stranger. The crate began to glow. Not bright. Not threatening. But warm. Like a lantern beneath silk. The archivist stepped back, hands trembling. "I don't want to touch it anymore," he whispered. "It doesn't want to leave." Back in Wellstein, news of the operation had leaked. Live video feeds showed the site fenced off, the dome hidden, guards posted at every corner. Reporters were turned away. Residents were told to remain calm. But calm was no longer a currency anyone was buying. A crowd gathered at the edge of the new barricades. Not shouting. Not rioting. Praying. Hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder, in complete silence, facing the park. They carried no banners. They had no demands. Their message was in their stillness. And then, the ground trembled. Not an earthquake. Not enough to break stone. Just enough to remind everyone that the earth, too, had memory. The dome, still buried beneath the tarp, shifted. And from beneath it, a sound. A deep, resonant hum. Not mechanical. Not man-made. A pulse. Then, a voice from the crowd. Soft. Clear. "She's coming." Lena had escaped. She slipped away from her house in the early morning, barefoot, holding nothing but her grandfather's scarf. She passed by the guards with ease. One claimed afterward that she seemed to disappear and reappear beside the outer fence. When she reached the crowd, they parted. No one told her what to do. She simply walked forward, placed her hand on the gate. And it opened. No code. No key. Just her presence. She entered the park and walked straight to the center. The guards didn't stop her. One stepped aside, tears welling in his eyes. Inside the dome, now fully uncovered, the silence was thick, almost holy. Dust danced in the air like memory. Lena walked to the center of the main hall, knelt on the floor, and whispered one word. Awake! The lights flickered. The wind stirred. And the scroll, still sealed inside the crate miles away, began to vibrate. Inside the military storage compound, lights failed. Cameras shut off. Systems crashed. And then, the scroll began to hum. Monitors recorded a soft, rhythmic pulse. Power surge detectors showed nothing. But everyone in the room felt it. Like a voice. Not audible, but undeniable. At exactly 3:33 p.m., the second minaret of the mosque, long buried beneath stone, pushed upward. No machines. No scaffolding. It rose as if lifted by memory itself. Someone in the crowd screamed. But not in fear. In awe. A CNN anchor covering the scene live paused mid-sentence, her voice shaking. We're witnessing something that defies everything we know. By nightfall, the Chancellor had no choice but to speak. She stood at a podium before the nation, visibly pale, her voice trembling. After consultations with experts, spiritual advisors, and constitutional scholars, I hereby declare the mosque in Wellstein a protected international site. All federal intervention will cease immediately. The scroll will be returned. The gates will remain open. She paused, then added quietly, some things are beyond politics. The next morning, before sunrise, the first call to prayer echoed from the mosque. But this time, it wasn't just for those of one faith. It was for all. And what followed wasn't a conversion. It was a return. People came by the thousands. Not to be seen, but to remember. To kneel. To breathe. To forgive. On the anniversary of the dome's first reappearance, a small plaque was placed at the entrance to the mosque. Not a government monument. Not a religious declaration. Just 5 simple words. This was never about walls. And in cities across the world, in New York, Istanbul, Seoul, Lagos, Lima, something strange began happening. Silence returned. Not as absence, but as presence. In cafes and classrooms, people paused without knowing why. On subways and sidewalks, strangers made eye contact and simply smiled. In Tokyo, a school canceled lessons for 1 hour of reflection. In Paris, police officers bowed their heads in silence during a moment of televised prayer. In Lahore, Hindus stood outside a mosque and said, "We feel it too." In Cape Town, a rabbi and an imam read from the scroll together, line by line, verse by verse. And in Wellstein, Lena returned to being a child. She laughed again, played again, and stopped dreaming. Not because the dreams were gone, but because the world had finally awakened. 1 year later, Matthias stood beneath the rising sun beside the mirror chamber. The crowd was smaller now, quieter, but still present. He opened a notebook and read the final words ever found inscribed at the mosque. They came to dig up a ruin, but found a mirror. They came to forget, but remembered everything. He looked at the gathered faces, of all colors, creeds, and countries, and added, "We buried what made us human. But even in silence, the earth remembered. And now we do too." No applause followed. Just peace. Just presence. And somewhere, beneath soil and stone, where memory sleeps and silence breathes, the light never stopped rising. It only waited for someone to see it again. A cool breeze rustled through the narrow stone streets of a quiet Eastern European town. The morning sun lit up the ancient buildings, and dry leaves danced in the air like forgotten pages of history. A small figure walked slowly down the cobblestone road. He wore a white robe that had faded with time, and carried a simple wooden string of prayer beads in his hand. His name was Ustaz Aziz. His steps were deliberate, steady. He was not just walking toward a building, he was walking into the heart of resistance. In front of him stood a towering, Gothic church, Christ's Church. Its old stone walls were dark with age, and its sharp steeples reached toward the sky like spears. This was not just a place of worship. It was a fortress of faith for the people who lived here, many of whom viewed Islam as a foreign threat. A few locals stood nearby as the old man approached. One of them smirked. "That must be the old preacher from the east," he muttered. Another chuckled. "He can barely walk. What's he doing here?" But Ustaz Aziz didn't respond. He simply whispered something quietly to himself and continued forward, his eyes focused on the heavy wooden doors in front of him. He knew very well that inside awaited not welcome, but confrontation. Not kindness, but challenge. He wasn't here to win an argument. He was here to speak the truth. As the church doors creaked open, a wave of mocking laughter greeted him. Dozens of people sat inside, filling the rows of benches. Their faces were filled with amusement, sarcasm, and superiority. A young man in the front row raised his eyebrows and said, "Look who decided to show up. Welcome to the place of real faith." Another man shouted, sparking more laughter. At the center of the altar stood a tall, silver-haired man in a flowing black robe. His name was Pastor Stephanus. His presence dominated the room. He looked down at Ustaz Aziz with a mocking smile, the kind of smile that says, "You don't belong here." But Ustaz Aziz didn't flinch. His face was calm. His hands didn't shake. His back remained straight as he walked toward the altar. When he reached the center of the hall, he stopped and addressed everyone with a warm greeting of peace. No one responded. Instead, the room echoed with scoffs and rude comments. One man clenched his fist and shouted, "We don't want blessings from someone who follows a false prophet." Still, Ustaz Aziz stood firm. Inside his heart, he reminded himself, "This is not about me. This is about truth. This is about defending the honor of the one I follow." He turned to Pastor Stephanus and said in a calm but firm voice, "I did not come here to be insulted or to insult you. I came to respond to your challenge, not with hatred, but with clarity." Pastor Stephanus stepped forward with theatrical flair. "So, you've come all this way just to be proven wrong?" he said. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But today you'll leave defeated. Today, we expose your so-called religion for the falsehood it is." Some people clapped. Others smirked. But Ustaz Aziz didn't respond with emotion. He said, "If this is to be a discussion, then let it be a respectful one. But I ask one thing, do not insult the man I follow. If you have questions, I will answer them. But I will not tolerate disrespect." That statement made some of the audience chuckle. They saw it as weakness. But the pastor paused, recognizing a quiet strength in the old man's words. He opened the large Bible on the altar and pointed to the crowd. "You all know he follows a man named Muhammad," he declared. "But this man isn't mentioned in our scripture. He came hundreds of years after Jesus. How can he be a real prophet?" Loud applause broke out. But Ustaz Aziz stepped forward slowly until he stood just 2 meters away from the pastor. His voice was steady. "I'm warning you," he said softly but with weight. "Do not repeat those words. Do not dishonor someone billions love and respect." The pastor raised his chin and said with a smirk, "I'm simply stating facts. Muhammad was just a desert leader. He used the sword, not revelation." In that moment, something changed. Ustaz Aziz stepped forward suddenly. With one trembling hand, he reached out and gently grabbed the collar of the pastor's robe, not violently, but with intensity. The room gasped. Some people stood up. Others moved forward. But everything froze when the old man spoke. "You can insult me," he said, voice trembling. "But if you speak against the honor of the man I follow again, I will not remain silent. My faith teaches peace. But the honor of my prophet is more sacred to me than my own life. Everyone in the church fell silent. Pastor Stephanus was shaken. He raised a hand to calm the growing tension. All right, he said, his tone lower. Let's keep this civil. I won't mention him again. But answer me this, if your religion is true, why did Christianity come first? Why did your messenger arrive centuries later claiming to complete what was already done? Ustaz Aziz released his grip and stood tall. Truth is not measured by who arrives first, he said. If that were the case, then evil would be more valid than good, because it existed before guidance. The devil came before humanity. But that doesn't make him right. He paused and continued. The prophets mentioned in your scripture, Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, they all preached the same message. They all called people to worship one God, without partners. They lived in submission to the Creator. That is the very essence of what I follow. Some people in the audience whispered among themselves. Pastor Stephanus looked amused. You're saying they were all like you? I'm saying, replied Ustaz Aziz, that they followed the same truth I follow. Worship one God. Don't assign partners to Him. Live righteously. Be honest. Serve the Creator, not creation. The pastor tried to laugh it off. But your prophet claimed to be the final messenger. Are you suggesting all these prophets were leading up to him? Ustaz Aziz nodded. Yes. The truth was revealed in parts, over generations. Each prophet carried the same flame, passed down through time. And the final messenger wasn't bringing a new fire, he was completing the message. He looked directly into Stephanus's eyes. In your scriptures, your Messiah prayed to God, fasted, wept, and said he was sent. Is that the behavior of God? Or the behavior of someone who submits to God? The audience was growing quieter now. Even those who had mocked at first were beginning to listen. And, Ustaz Aziz added, your scriptures also mention the coming of someone after Jesus. Someone who would continue the truth. But we'll get to that. Pastor Stephanus's smile faded. You came prepared, he muttered. I didn't come for battle, the old man replied. I came for truth. The grand church that once echoed with laughter now sat in a stunned hush. The silence wasn't forced, it was thoughtful. Even the stained glass windows seemed to hold their breath. Ustaz Aziz stood at the front, facing not just Pastor Stephanus, but an entire room full of confused and curious hearts. The tension that once filled the air with arrogance had turned into something deeper, reflection. Pastor Stephanus, attempting to reclaim control, stepped closer to the altar. He gestured dramatically toward the Bible in front of him and said, Then explain something very simple. You claim to follow all prophets. You claim they brought one message. But how do you explain the crucifixion? Our faith is built on this truth, that Jesus died for our sins. He was nailed to the cross, suffered, and rose again. That sacrifice brought salvation. Do you deny that? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others folded their arms. All eyes returned to the old man in white. Ustaz Aziz did not move hastily. He placed his prayer beads down beside him and walked slowly toward the center of the room. He looked directly at Stephanus and asked, Let me ask you something in return. Do you believe that God is all-powerful, all-merciful, and all-wise? Yes, of course. The pastor responded confidently. Then why? Aziz asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Would an all-powerful God need to torture himself, or his son, in order to forgive people? Stephanus blinked. Some in the audience looked at each other. If he truly is merciful, Aziz continued, could he not forgive without blood? Did he not forgive Adam without sacrifice? Did he not forgive the people of Nineveh without crucifixion? If forgiveness is real, why would it require pain, nails, and a cross? The pastor's lips tightened. Because it was the only way to redeem mankind. Jesus paid the price. Ustaz Aziz nodded slowly. And yet, according to your own scripture, Jesus fell on his face and prayed to be saved from the cross. In the book of Matthew, chapter 26, it says he pleaded, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Why would he say that if crucifixion was his mission? Now the silence in the room grew heavier. A woman near the front lowered her head, visibly shaken. A young man in the third pew pulled out a pocket Bible and began flipping through its pages. And when he was finally on the cross, Aziz said, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Does that sound like the voice of God? Or the voice of a servant in pain? Stephanus's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. He was showing us humility. He was setting an example. Aziz's reply came swiftly. God doesn't need to set an example by suffering. Does the Creator need to bleed to show love? Would you say a king must stab himself to prove his power to his people? Or would a wise king forgive with compassion and justice? No answer came. So Aziz continued, "Let us also consider another passage, Luke chapter 24. After the resurrection, when Jesus appeared to his followers, it says they didn't recognize him. Why not? Why would his closest followers fail to identify him?" The pastor remained silent. In that same passage, Aziz said, now addressing the audience, Jesus shows them his hands and feet, eats broiled fish in front of them, and tells them he is not a spirit. He insists he has flesh and bones. But if he was resurrected in a divine, spiritual body, why would he need to eat? Why would he need to prove that he wasn't a ghost? A wave of unease spread across the room. Stephanus stepped back. Because he was real. Because he came back to show victory over death. Aziz tilted his head slightly. Or perhaps, he never died at all. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he added, "If your faith rests on the idea that someone else's pain removes your guilt, is that justice? If someone innocent is punished so the guilty go free, is that love or is that injustice?" Now the murmurs were growing again, but this time they carried doubt, not mockery. Aziz stepped forward and spoke clearly. There is no need for blood to buy forgiveness. There is no need for crucifixion to earn love. A loving God does not demand a ransom. He accepts repentance. A merciful God does not need a body to die. He lifts his messengers, protects their honor, and answers their prayers. From the back, a middle-aged man stood up. His voice shook as he said, "Then what happened, if he wasn't crucified?" Aziz looked at him gently. He was saved. What was seen on the cross was someone else, perhaps made to look like him. But the true Jesus, the messenger of God, was protected and raised up. This was not a trick. It was a protection. The pastor clenched his fists. That's not what the Bible says. Aziz turned to him slowly. Which version? The one written decades after his departure? The one with differing accounts? The four Gospels that contradict each other on key details of the crucifixion? Someone audibly gasped. Aziz raised his hand softly, calming the room. "I'm not here to insult your beliefs," he said. "I'm here to ask you to think. To reflect. If your heart is sincere, ask yourself, would God require suffering in order to forgive? Or would he simply forgive, as he always has?" Pastor Stephanus looked visibly shaken. He returned to the pulpit, his hands trembling slightly. You speak with confidence. But our faith is older. It came before yours." Aziz nodded. "And water existed before soap. But it is the combination that cleans. Just because something came first doesn't make it final. Darkness comes before light. But it is light that guides." Several people in the audience nodded slowly. Some bowed their heads, overwhelmed by emotions they had never expected to feel that morning. "You claim," Stephanus said in a last attempt, "that your messenger was the last. Then where is he mentioned in our books? Aziz looked directly at him. In the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 7, Jesus says, "It is better for you that I go away. For if I do not go, the advocate will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him." He paused, then added, "Who was this advocate? Who came after Jesus? Who brought a new message confirming what came before and correcting what was changed?" The church was still now. Even the pastor had no answer. Aziz walked back to the center and said gently, "I am not asking you to betray Jesus. I'm asking you to return to the real Jesus. The one who prayed. The one who fasted. The one who never claimed to be God, but always pointed to God." And with that, he sat down. The silence was no longer awkward. It was deep. Still. Holy. Some people wiped their eyes. Others sat frozen, their fingers clutched around the edges of their chairs. The foundation of their beliefs had just been shaken, not with violence, but with words that struck the soul. And Pastor Stephanus, for the first time, looked less like a preacher and more like a man searching for the ground beneath his feet. The massive wooden doors of Christ's church had been closed for centuries to anything but Sunday sermons and familiar doctrine. But now, the air inside had shifted. The once rigid walls that echoed hymns and sermons were now holding something entirely new: silence. Not a silence of disinterest or boredom. A silence of realization. Pastor Stephanus stood at the edge of the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the podium. He looked down at the Bible in front of him but could not read a word. His thoughts were scattered. His heart was pounding. He had just listened to an old man, a man he had expected to crush, dismantle the very pillars of his theological confidence with calm logic, scriptural evidence, and unwavering faith. Across the pews, the congregation was visibly shaken. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were flipping through their Bibles, looking for the verses they had never truly examined. A few sat stone still, eyes glazed in thought, like they had just woken from a dream and weren't sure what world they had entered. One elderly woman leaned toward her daughter and whispered, "He never said he was God. I've read the Gospels my whole life, but he never said it. Not once." Ustaz Aziz remained seated on the lower step of the altar, his legs folded beneath him, his wooden prayer beads resting beside him. His face was not triumphant. It was soft, tired, compassionate. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before, in prison cells, in war zones, in refugee camps. Truth didn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes, it came like a soft knock in a quiet room. Pastor Stephanus raised his eyes, now glassy and full of inner struggle. "I've preached for 30 years, he said, his voice quieter than before. "I've baptized hundreds. I've debated priests, skeptics, even Muslims. But I've never felt like this." He paused, then looked directly at Aziz. "If everything I believed is wrong, if everything I taught was incomplete, what do I do now?" The entire room leaned in. The moment had arrived. Ustaz Aziz stood slowly. Despite his age, his back remained straight. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady. "Truth is not ashamed to confront error. And forgiveness is never too far for anyone who seeks it. You cannot erase the past, Stephanus. But you can correct the future." The pastor nodded slowly, breathing heavily. He stepped down from the altar and approached Aziz. With trembling fingers he removed the wooden cross that had hung around his neck since he was a young man and held it in his palm. He looked at it, not with hatred, but with sorrow, and then laid it gently on the altar. "I believed I was defending the truth," he said. "But I never questioned why the truth needed defense through confusion, contradiction, and blind obedience. You came here alone, with no weapon but your words. And you tore down walls I've built my whole life." Aziz walked to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "The truth doesn't destroy. It rebuilds. It doesn't mock. It invites. Then, from the back of the church, a young man stood up. His name was Marco. He had once ridiculed Aziz when he entered. Now, he was visibly shaking. I want to know more, he said. I don't know what's right anymore. But I know what I just heard makes sense. Another voice rose. A woman with streaks of gray in her hair wiped her cheeks and said, I've always been afraid to ask questions. They told me it was dangerous. But now I feel like not asking was the danger. One by one, people began to stand. Not many at first. Just a few. But their expressions weren't of rebellion or excitement. They were humble. Raw. Vulnerable. Pastor Stephanus, now no longer the preacher, but a man among others, spoke quietly. How do we begin again? Aziz looked around at the gathered people and spoke with tenderness. By seeking the one who created you. By returning to the path of all the prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus. Not worshipping them, but walking where they walked. Living how they lived. The church had transformed from a battleground of ideologies into a house of reflection. The altar was no longer a stage, it was a place of awakening. The large cross that once stood tall now lay flat, respectfully placed aside, not out of hatred, but recognition. Recognition that God was never in need of a symbol to be real. In the silence that followed, something profound happened. A woman near the front fell to her knees and cried. I don't know how to say it. I don't know the right words. But I want to follow the one true God. The God who forgives without blood. Who accepts without punishment. Aziz stepped forward gently. The words don't need to be perfect. The heart does. Speak with your heart. And with trembling breath, the woman said, I believe there is only one God, and I want to follow the messenger who came with the truth. From that moment, others followed. A man who had once been a local church leader stood up and said, I was born into this religion. But I never chose it. Today, I choose something else. Today, I choose truth. Tears began to fall freely. Hugs were exchanged. Strangers embraced. Some fell to the floor, overwhelmed by emotion, as if a lifetime of spiritual burden had been lifted in a single hour. And in the center of it all stood Pastor Stephanus, now simply Stephanus, a man returning to his Creator. He looked at Aziz and said with a broken voice, Do you think, after all I've done, that God will still accept me? Aziz didn't hesitate. God's mercy is greater than all sin. If you turn to Him with sincerity, He will not turn you away. You were chosen today not to be humiliated, but to be shown the light. You are not defeated. You are being reborn. The morning light pierced through the church windows now, illuminating dust particles in the air like golden sparks. It felt as if the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. And outside the church, birds began to sing. Outside, the sky had changed. What was once a cloudy morning now opened up with warm sunlight, as if nature itself was responding to what had taken place inside the Christus church. The old stone structure, for centuries a monument of strict doctrine and rigid identity, had become something else, something alive. Something that breathed truth. Inside, the energy had shifted completely. What began as a confrontation had evolved into something no one expected. People who had entered with confidence in their old beliefs now sat in silence, some weeping, others staring into space, clutching small Bibles as if they had lost their meaning. Stephanus, the man who once stood boldly at the pulpit, now sat cross-legged on the floor beside Ustaz Aziz. The former pastor's robe was folded neatly beside him. His collar was gone. What remained was not a priest, not a leader, but a man, just a man, looking for redemption. I feel like I've been wearing someone else's skin my whole life, he said softly. And today, I finally took it off. Aziz nodded gently. Sometimes finding the truth doesn't feel like learning something new. It feels like remembering something you always knew but had forgotten. In the church courtyard, small groups began to form. People weren't leaving. They couldn't. It was as if their feet were frozen in place, unwilling to step away from what they had witnessed. A group of young men stood under a large oak tree near the entrance. One of them, Marco, the same man who had once laughed when Aziz entered, was now asking question after question. "So, the messenger you follow, he lived like the prophets before him?" "Yes," replied Stephanus, his voice carrying more peace than it ever had behind the pulpit. "He prayed like them. He fasted like them. He forbade idol worship. He cared for the poor, respected women, and lived with such simplicity. Not in palaces. Not with an army. Just with the truth." Marco's eyes widened. "And he never claimed to be divine?" "No," Stephanus said. "He called people to worship the Creator, not himself. Just like Jesus did. Just like Moses did. That is the beauty of it. That is what makes it real." Inside the church, women gathered near the side aisle. Some held each other's hands. Others sat quietly, processing. One elderly woman, who had been a member of the church for over 40 years, now held a small notebook in which she had written a few words from Aziz's earlier speech. She read them aloud slowly. "God doesn't need blood to forgive. He only needs sincerity." Tears fell from her eyes. "Why did no one ever say it like that before?" she whispered. Another younger woman replied, "Maybe we weren't ready to hear it. Or maybe the truth has always been around us, but we never looked closely." A child walked up to Aziz, no more than 10 years old. Her voice was timid, but her eyes were full of curiosity. "Do I need to be someone else to follow your God?" she asked. Aziz smiled warmly. "No, little one. You don't need to change your face, your language, or your family. You only need to open your heart. That's where the journey begins." A middle-aged man who had worked as an evangelist in the town stepped forward next. He had remained in the back during the debate, quiet and cautious. But now, something inside him had broken free. "I want to say something," he said loudly enough for those gathered outside and inside to hear. "I didn't come here today expecting to change. I came here to witness a debate, to watch a Muslim preacher fail." He paused, looking at Aziz. "But what I saw wasn't a man trying to win. I saw a man trying to save. I've spent my life quoting verses I barely understood. Today I realized I've been preaching shadows while he brought the sun." He turned to the crowd. "I don't know all the answers yet. But I do know this: I want to learn. I want to know the truth for myself." Aziz placed a hand on his shoulder. "Truth is not a destination. It's a path. And the first step is to admit that you want it." Voices began to rise, but not in anger or division. They were voices of hope, of apology, of excitement. People were not arguing, they were asking. Not resisting, they were reaching. For the first time in perhaps centuries, the bells of Christ's church rang not for tradition, but transformation. Not for ritual, but rebirth. A group of teenagers who had once mocked faith now sat around a young man named David, who had been among the first to stand after the debate ended. "I never believed in anything," he admitted. "Not God, not religion, nothing. But what he said, about there being one creator, one message passed from prophet to prophet, it made sense in a way nothing else ever did." One of the girls next to him whispered, "What do we do now?" "Learn," David replied. "And live better." Inside the church, Stephanus turned to Aziz and asked, "Do you realize what you've done here? This town, this church, it won't be the same." Aziz looked up at the stained glass window above the altar. The sun had hit it just right. The colored light beamed down across the benches, soft and warm. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Truth simply walked into a place that had kept the doors shut for too long." Outside, the people were now sitting on the stone steps, on the grass, on the benches. Not one person had left. It was as if something invisible held them there, a weightless pull of meaning they couldn't explain. And then, from the far side of the courtyard, a woman stood up and raised her voice. I don't have all the knowledge. I don't know all the verses. But I know I believe in one God. I know I believe that Jesus was his servant, not his equal. And I want to start my life again, from today. Her voice cracked, but no one laughed. No one mocked. Instead, others joined her. One by one. One after another. I believe. I believe. I believe. They didn't all know what came next. But that didn't matter. Belief had begun. Aziz looked around. The grass. The trees. The old church. The people. All bathed in the same light. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was undeniable. A silent revolution of the soul. And deep in his heart, Aziz knew, this was not the end of a debate. This was the beginning of a movement. By midday, the Christchurch church no longer looked like the place it had been just a few hours earlier. The stained glass windows still glowed with color, and the ancient stone walls still stood tall. But something had changed inside. The heavy tension that once filled the air had dissolved, replaced by something more profound, peace. There were no more loud voices, no arguments, and no debate. There were only quiet conversations, tearful hugs, and hearts searching for a path forward. Inside, Pastor Stephanus, now Stephanus the man, not the title, sat on the floor with his head resting in his hands. Around him, several members of his former congregation were seated with open notebooks, Bibles, and handwritten notes from the day's conversation. Some were still weeping, others were deep in thought. The once intimidating altar now seemed distant, like a monument to a past they had begun to let go of. Ustaz Aziz remained seated quietly near the front. His back was straight, but his eyes reflected fatigue. He had not moved much, yet he had spoken volumes. The old man had come not to fight, but to reveal. And now, his mission was unfolding like dawn after the longest night. Stephanus looked up with swollen eyes and said, I don't think I'll ever be able to explain to people what happened here. It wasn't just words. It was like someone turned on a light in my chest. Aziz smiled faintly. Truth isn't something you memorize. It's something you recognize. Stephanus nodded. But now I wonder, what about all those I misled? I stood here, right here, and preached ideas I now see differently. Can I ever fix that? Aziz replied. You don't need to fix everything. You just need to be honest from today onward. Let the people who once followed you now follow your honesty. Let them witness the change in you, and they'll find the courage to change themselves. Stephanus lowered his head, humbled. And what do I do now? Begin again, said Aziz. As a student. Outside in the courtyard, the transformation was spreading. Dozens of people had gathered, some sitting in small circles, others approaching Aziz's companions for guidance. The conversations weren't dramatic. They were soft, sincere, and raw. Realizations were happening slowly but powerfully, like waves shaping the shore. A group of young adults sat beneath the old church bell tower, where the sound of metal had once signaled worship based on tradition. Now, it was their laughter and tears that filled the space. A young woman named Elena turned to her friend, eyes puffy from crying. I was always told that questioning meant weakness. But today I learned that questioning was what led me here. Her friend, Tomas, nodded. I used to think that following meant obeying blindly. But now I see that real following starts when your heart is awake. An older man who had remained silent all morning finally spoke. He was one of the senior members of the church, a former trustee. I thought age made me wise, he said, but I realize now that I've simply grown old with closed eyes. Today, I opened them for the first time. Inside, a mother approached Aziz with her teenage daughter. She looked worried, but her expression was mixed with hope. "My daughter wants to follow what you've shared today," the woman said. "But she's afraid. What will the others say? Her classmates, our neighbors, even my own husband." Aziz took a long breath and then looked at the girl. "Truth is not always easy," he said gently. "Sometimes it costs comfort. But comfort without truth is a cage. If you choose truth, the path may be narrow, but it will always be straight. Walk it with sincerity, and you will never walk alone." The girl began to cry quietly. Her mother held her tighter. One of the former Sunday school teachers stepped forward with a torn Bible in her hand, not torn from damage, but marked with sticky notes and highlighted passages. "All my life," she said, "I taught others using verses I never questioned. Today, when he said God does not need to suffer to forgive, it shattered something in me. I always believed God was merciful, but I never asked why he would demand pain." She looked around the room. "Now I want to learn all over again," Aziz replied softly. "Then today is not an ending. It is your first real beginning." From the far end of the courtyard, the church caretaker, a man who had lived in a small room beside the bell tower for 20 years, walked slowly to the center of the gathering. He was an unassuming man, often overlooked, always quiet. But now, he stood with a firm expression. "I used to polish the cross every Sunday," he said. "I used to light the candles before every service. I never questioned why we needed to light them. But today, I feel like the light was already inside us. We just didn't look for it." He then turned to Stephanus. "You weren't wrong all these years. You were just waiting to be set free." Stephanus could no longer hold back his tears. "Everything I feared is happening," he said. "But not how I expected. I thought losing my role would mean losing my life. But now, I feel more alive than ever." Aziz placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is what truth does. It doesn't burn you. It cleanses you." Later that afternoon, something truly remarkable happened. Without being asked, without announcement, dozens of people walked to the front of the church and stood silently. One by one, they began declaring their belief in one Creator. Some whispered it. Others spoke through tears. A few held their hands to their hearts. They had never recited a ritual. They didn't know the exact words. But what they offered was more valuable than perfection. They offered sincerity. A young boy, barely 14, looked up and said, "I want to live the way the messengers lived. I want to worship the one they worshipped." No one stopped him. No one corrected him. Everyone watched. And everyone understood. The church walls, once guardians of fixed ideas, now witnessed something timeless. The sounds that once echoed from the pulpit had been replaced by new voices, new convictions, and new faith. And in the corner, Aziz closed his eyes, whispering gratitude not to the crowd, not to himself, but to the one who guides hearts. By the time the sun began its descent behind the hills, the old town no longer looked the same. It was as if time had slowed down, not in silence, but in reflection. The Christus Church, which had stood like a fortress of dogma for generations, had become the epicenter of something extraordinary. The church's front steps were filled with people. Some were sitting quietly, gazing at the sky. Others talked in hushed voices. Children played at a distance, unaware of the revolution unfolding in their parents' hearts. It was not the revolution of swords or banners, but of ideas, of souls unchained. Inside the church, the air smelled of old wood and something new, something warm and human. Laughter. Tears. Forgiveness. Discovery. A man named Lucas, a former church council member, leaned against one of the stone columns, his arms folded across his chest. "This place used to feel like a cage," he whispered. "We followed schedules. We followed rituals. But I never felt anything here. Not like today." Near him stood Sophia, a high school teacher. Her voice cracked as she replied. I taught religion classes for 12 years. I told students that faith meant not asking too many questions. But now I wonder, was I stopping them from finding the very truth I feared? From across the church, the small wooden confessional booths, once used for whispered apologies to clergy, stood empty. No one needed to confess to men anymore. Today, hearts were speaking directly to the Creator. Stephanus, no longer a pastor but a student of truth, walked the aisles slowly. His shoes tapped gently against the marble floor. People stopped him to ask questions. Not with the fear they once had, but with excitement, like children discovering a world beyond the walls they had inherited. Why don't we worship Jesus anymore? A young girl asked him. He smiled. Because even Jesus never asked to be worshipped. He taught people to pray to the one who sent him. That's what he lived for. And that's what we now return to. In the side room of the church, which had once been used for choir practice, a group of women now gathered to learn how to pray in a new way, not through statues or songs, but through stillness and sincerity. An older woman, once the choir director, held her hands over her chest and said, I used to sing about salvation. But now I feel it, quietly, without music, without performance. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Aziz sat under the same tree he had passed earlier that morning. His legs were folded, his face calm, and his hands rested on his knees. He was surrounded by curious minds, young and old, rich and poor, formerly devout and formerly doubtful. One man asked, Why didn't you debate with anger? Aziz looked up. Because truth doesn't need to yell. It only needs to be spoken clearly. The hearts that are ready will hear it. The ones that aren't, only time can open them. Another man asked, But how can we live differently now? We've followed a path for so long. What happens to our identity? Aziz replied, Truth doesn't erase who you are. It transforms what you live for. Keep your names, your culture, your memories. But build a new purpose inside them, one that aligns with the truth you now recognize. The young woman named Elena, who had first questioned blindly, now sat in the group with newfound confidence. She raised her hand. But what about the world outside this town? What about our families, our employers, our critics? They won't understand. They might call us traitors. Aziz looked at her gently. Truth has never been easy. If it were, every prophet would have been welcomed, not rejected. Every reformer would have been embraced, not persecuted. But truth doesn't need approval, it only needs courage. Then he asked the group, Tell me, do you feel more afraid or more free today? There was silence at first. Then one by one, voices responded. Free. Finally free. I've never felt lighter. Tears fell again. Not from sadness. From relief. Later that evening, as lanterns were lit and the town square grew dim, something remarkable happened. A man who had once been a fierce opponent of Islam, someone who had written articles and delivered speeches mocking Muslims, stood up and walked toward Aziz. His name was Karl. He had once called Islam a backward religion, filled with violence and oppression. Today, he walked slowly, humbly, until he stood face to face with the man he had once despised. I hated what I didn't understand, he said quietly. But I see now that I was never shown the truth. I only saw what media wanted me to see. What fear wanted me to feel. Aziz didn't respond with bitterness. He extended his hand. Truth doesn't hold grudges, he said. It welcomes everyone who approaches it sincerely. Karl took his hand, then dropped to his knees. I want to begin again. Nearby, several women who had grown up Catholic now stood together, each holding hands. One of them, a woman in her 50s, whispered, I never thought I'd say this. But I want to live for the Creator, not for tradition. I want to worship directly, not through a priest, not through a son of God, but through a relationship with the one who made me. That night, people didn't go home. They stayed in the church and around it, talking, praying, thinking. The building that had once been a stage for weekly routine had become a sanctuary for truth seekers. No one issued a command. No one forced a decision. People simply felt something stir inside them, and they followed it. Stephanus sat beside Aziz as the stars appeared above. "I spent years trying to defend doctrine," he said. "But now I see, truth doesn't need defending. It only needs revealing." Aziz looked up at the night sky. "And once revealed," he replied, "it takes care of everything else." A breeze passed through the trees. The church bell, untouched, swayed slightly and let out a soft, accidental ring. It wasn't planned. But it felt like a confirmation. A town that had once been asleep had opened its eyes. Not to chaos, but to clarity. As night turned to early morning, a soft light crept over the rooftops of the old town. Birds began their quiet songs, and the sky blushed with the first signs of dawn. But inside the Christus church, no one had slept. No one had even thought about leaving. Something greater than routine had kept them rooted in place. They had come for a debate. They stayed for the truth. The stone walls that once echoed with tradition now held a different kind of memory, a memory of release, of rediscovery, of return. In every corner of the building, people sat with open eyes and open hearts, as if afraid that if they blinked, it would all disappear. Pastor Stephanus, now simply Stephanus, sat with a young man named Daniel. Daniel had been raised in the church, served as an altar boy, and led youth Bible studies. His entire life was structured around the church. But today, he held a different kind of book in his hands. A plain notebook filled with scribbled notes from the debate. "Everything I believed," Daniel whispered. "I believed because I never questioned it. I just assumed what I was told was the whole story." Stephanus nodded. "So did I. But when you discover that the truth was never hidden by evil men, but simply buried under layers of assumptions, you can't ignore it anymore. It haunts you until you face it." Daniel looked at him, tears in his eyes. "And now that we've found it, what do we do?" "You protect it," Stephanus replied. "And you live it. Not for show. Not to prove anything to others. But because you know what it cost you to finally see it." In the center aisle, where candles were once lit in memory of saints, a new group had gathered. Some were holding hands. Some sat in silence. Others whispered prayers they barely understood. They weren't scholars. They weren't preachers. They were just ordinary people, farmers, mothers, students, laborers, who had felt something shift. Ustaz Aziz, seated at the front, took one final look at the place where he had stood the day before. He remembered the laughter, the insults, the pressure to walk away. And now he saw peace. A woman walked up to him. Her name was Maria. She had grown up in the town, and her father had once been the lead cantor of the church. "I've always loved Jesus," she said softly. "But I never understood him. I was told to worship him. But everything I heard from you yesterday, about how he prayed, how he taught others to serve the Creator, I feel like I met him for the first time." Aziz looked at her kindly. "That's because you met the real him. Not the image carved into wood. Not the story edited for politics. But the man who called others to truth, not to himself." She cried as she said, "I want to walk that path. Even if I lose friends. Even if people call me a traitor." Aziz replied gently, "Those who follow the truth often walk alone at first. But eventually the road becomes crowded with others who are just waiting for someone to go first." From outside the church, someone shouted, "Come quickly!" A crowd gathered by the entrance. What they saw outside stunned them. Hundreds of people stood in the street, townspeople, travelers, and even some who had rejected the invitation the day before. Word had spread. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of restlessness, and some quietly out of desperation. One man stepped forward, trembling. "I wasn't here yesterday," he said, "but I heard what happened. I've been watching this place my whole life. I saw Stephanus preach with fire. But today, I see him humble. And I see him at peace. That means more to me than any sermon." Another woman cried, "I want to believe, but I don't know where to start." Aziz stepped forward. His voice was soft but firm. "You start where truth begins, with the heart. You don't need to know everything. You just need to be sincere." Then something powerful happened. People began to step forward, one by one, with trembling hands, with tearful eyes, with hearts that had once been sealed, now opening like petals to sunlight. They weren't repeating lines. They were making decisions. A young boy, barely 12, raised his hand. "I want to live like the messengers. I want to serve the Creator who sent them." His father stood behind him, hands shaking, speechless. And then he stepped forward too. An old man in the crowd, known for his bitterness and stubbornness, took a deep breath and said, "I mocked what I didn't understand. But my soul is tired. And I can't walk away from what I saw yesterday." Tears fell from the eyes of grown men who had never cried before. Women hugged strangers. Children watched in awe. In the distance, a flock of birds flew overhead in perfect formation. The bells of the church, untouched since the day before, rang softly in the wind. It was as if the very town was witnessing a rebirth. Stephanus looked around, speechless. He turned to Aziz and whispered, "Do you see what you've done?" Aziz smiled. "No," he said. "This was never me. This was what happens when hearts hear what they were made to hear. I only delivered the message. The rest belongs to the one who made them all." Stephanus wept. "I used to think faith was tradition. Now I know faith is transformation." Aziz placed his hand on Stephanus's shoulder. "And today," he said, "you witnessed something few ever do. You saw truth walk into a place built to resist it, and win. Not through force. Not through fear. But through clarity, sincerity, and the courage to speak." The sun rose fully. And for the first time in living memory, the Christus church was filled not just with light, but with guidance. And long after Aziz had left the town, the people remained. Not as followers of men. Not as prisoners of heritage. But as souls who chose truth. Freely. And forever.